the Dragonborn, one of fantasy's most niche races, and subsequently, one of its most oddly sexualized. As a true son of Skyrim, I can admit, I've had my fair share of lusty Argonian mates. But the dark urge in Baldur's Gate, let's just say this scaly race, hasn't created any dark urges for me personally. Now, the Dragonborn has some of the strongest visual concepts in all of fantasy, but despite having such a strong visual identity, the Dragonborn often have a strangely weak cultural identity, or at least in my opinion. Today, we're going to talk about the Dragonborn and everything that makes them fascinating in a world-building and narrative context, why they're so niche, and we'll even dabble into the sexualization of them. Though for that last part, I doubt we'll find an answer. We'll also be including Dragonborn adjacent creatures like Dragon King, Half Dragon, and Were Dragon into this conversation. So enough explaining and let's dive into the video. So what actually is the Dragonborn? At the most basic level, Dragonborn are humanoid dragons. They're large, heavily built people covered in scales, usually standing well over 6 feet tall. They normally have clawed hands, draconic heads, and horns, and depending on how freaked out your artist is, a tail. Unlike elves, dwarves, and orcs, however, the Dragonborn is really not one of the universally recognized fantasy races. The capital D Dragonborn belong specifically to Dungeons & Dragons, but the broader idea of dragon people appear all across fantasy under dozens of different names. Some are descendants of dragons, some were created by dragons to serve as soldiers, others are actually dragons who've taken humanoid form, and some are basically just giant lizard people whom the audience have collectively agreed look close enough. In Dungeons & Dragons, Dragonborn are their own distinct people. They're not usually half-dragons, nor are they humans who slowly transformed into dragons. They hatch from eggs, and unlike their airborne cousins, they generally don't have wings. That's kind of what is supposed to level out the playing field, I suppose. Now, even though they don't fly, they possess a lot of draconic powers. For example, they typically possess the ability to breathe some element as a weapon, and also have some natural resistance to that same element. For example, a red dragon can breathe fire and is harder to burn, while a blue dragon might spit lightning and is less likely to be electrocuted. Basically, Dragon 101 type stuff. But D&D is only one interpretation of the idea. World of Warcraft has the Drakthir, draconic soldiers created by Notharian who shift between humanoid or dragon-like forms. Fire Emblem has Manicheets, who are ancient dragons who seal their power inside of magical stones and live disguised as people. Dragon Quest has the Dragovians, who can transform between human but possess the ability to become a dragon. Even the lizards in Divinity Original Sin 2, while technically not being Dragonborn, occupy many of the same fantasy niches. At least when we're talking about fire-breathing reptilian people. Then you have the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, my favorite game of all time, where Dragonborn means something completely different. The Dragonborn in Skyrim is not a dragon person at all. They're a mortal born with the soul and power of a dragon, which for some reason translates into huffing dragon souls and stealing their bones. But there is no single definition that works for every setting. A Dragonborn might be a humanoid person, a Dragonborn might be a humanoid dragon, a dragon trapped in a humanoid body, a mortal carrying around dragon blood, or an artificial race created from draconic power. Though I will admit, the D&D interpretation seems to be the most popular by far. For the rest of this video, most of the ideas that we will allude to will be in reference to D&D's Dragonborn, or the very, very close variety. That being the Drakthir, Divinity Lizards, and one big caveat, this will not include Argonians. No, that'll be a separate video, and the Lizard Boys are distinctively different from the Dragon Kin. Anyway, a great question to ask, where did the Dragonborn come from? The interesting thing about the Dragonborn is that they don't really come from mythology. Nobody discovered an ancient Norse legend about a 7-foot-tall dragon man who could breathe lightning and immediately added it to Dungeons & Dragons. Mythology obviously contains dragons, serpent people, and heroes descended from dragons, but the Dragonborn as we recognize them are largely a modern fantasy invention. Dungeons & Dragons has been slowly creating Dragonborn for decades. The game already had lizard folk, kobolds, half-dragons, and dragon-themed classes, and about 17 different ways to turn your character into something increasingly dragon-shaped. The reason is obvious. The game is called Dungeons & Dragons, and naturally people want to play as a dragon. One of the earliest major predecessors was the Draconian from Dragonlance in the 1980s. Draconians were humanoid soldiers created by corrupting the eggs of good dragons. They had wings, different varieties, and unique powers, but they were primarily villains. They looked a lot like the modern Dragonborn, sure, but they were less of a complete civilization and more of an army of magically manufactured dragon goons. And that's goon as in the 1980s way, not the 2026 way. D&D has also experimented with letting people play actual dragon. In the 1994 setting, Council of Worms, players were allowed to create dragon characters and participate in an entirely draconic society. That was extremely cool, but it does turn out that enormous flying reptiles are slightly difficult to fit inside of most dungeons, and they're even harder to balance. 3rd edition brought things closer, with playable half-dragons and an enormous collection of draconic races, abilities, feats, and character options. By this point, D&D had built a massive pile of dragon person ideas that could eventually be combined into one recognizable race. The actual name Dragonborn first appeared in the 2000 book Races of the Dragon, but these dragon were different. They weren't their own race just yet. Instead, an elf, dwarf, or human or other humanoid could dedicate themselves to Bahamut, climb inside of the magical egg, and emerge transformed into a draconic warrior. Typical Tuesday afternoon shenanigans, I will admit. Eventually, the modern Dragonborn arrived with the 4th edition in 2008. Its designers took D&D's many dragon person concepts and combined them into one core playable race. Dragonborn were now naturally born people with their own bloodlines, civilizations, and cultural identity. When 5th edition launched in 2014, Dragonborn remained a core option. Their Forgotten Realms history emphasized that many originated on Abir, where their ancestry had been enslaved by dragons before part of their civilization was transported to Toril. This gave them one of their more interesting characteristics, that despite looking like dragons and being named Dragonborn, many of them actually hate dragons. The Dragonborn were assembled across several decades from draconians, half-dragons, and playable dragons, and the universal childhood desire to play as a fire-breathing lizard with a sword. So, what actually makes Dragonborns unique? The first and most obvious thing is their appearance. Dragonborn possess one of the strongest character designs in fantasy. Even if you know absolutely nothing about the setting, you immediately understand what you're looking at. This is a humanoid dragon. It's probably incredibly strong and almost certainly breathes fire. And it could remove your head with just one hand. They capture everything that people already love about dragons. The horns, the scales, the claws, the elemental powers, and the overwhelming physical presence. But place it inside of a character who can actually participate in a normal story. A dragon usually has to be a monster, god, or a final boss. But a Dragonborn can be a soldier, a merchant, or just a complete idiot. They take something distinct and legendary and allow it to become a human without literally turning into a human. Next, and on the same theme, Dragonborns aren't merely reptilian people. They possess an actual piece of a dragon's power. Depending on the setting, they might breathe fire, poison, or frost, and depending on how they use it, they can actually influence the story far more than just in combat. Think that maybe Dragonborn children would have to learn not to burn down their homes, or their cities would be built from stone instead of metal. Different elemental bloodlines could settle completely different environments, develop specialized professions, or even form their own classes. A fire-breathing dragon might be a legendary blacksmith, while one resistant to cold could live in a place that would kill most other races. This simple ability gives the Dragonborn almost unlimited world-building potential, but my favorite thing about Dragonborn is their relationship with actual dragons. Depending on the story, Dragonborn might be descendants of dragons, created from dragons, worshippers of dragons, or my favorite, former slaves who absolutely despise them. The last version, I don't know what it is about lizards being slaves, but The Elder Scrolls has this as well. In D&D, many Dragonborn hate dragons because their ancestors were enslaved by them. So this creates an entire people who look like the creature that they hate the most. That can immediately create a very cool identity crisis. Do they view their draconic features as a source of pride or scars left behind from their creators? Would a Dragonborn consider an actual dragon an ancestor or god, or just a monster that needs to be killed? These three elements, their incredible design, their elemental biology, and their complicated connection with dragon, give the Dragonborn more immediate world-building potential than most other fantasy races. So the natural question arises, are they popular? Well, yes and no. I think they actually sit right in the middle of the pack when it comes to fantasy races. Now, on one hand, when it comes to D&D specifically, we can see they're actually the third most popular race when it comes to D&D Beyond metrics. And when it comes to Baldur's Gate, which I feel has a more broad audience, they sit firmly in the middle. Outside of D&D, dragon people are nowhere near as common as elves, dwarves, or orcs. Plenty of fantasy settings have something resembling them, but they've never become one of those standard fantasy races that audiences simply expect to see. However, when we narrow things down to just beast races, Dragonborn are easily among the most popular. They have a massive advantage because dragons are already one of the coolest and most beloved creatures in fantasy. But we do see a lot of competition from the more traditional lizard folk. Most stories traditionally will have one or the other. They're also popular enough to have developed a fairly dedicated fan base, including plenty of reptilian furries, which does seem to defeat the purpose of being a furry. If there isn't any fur involved, I guess we're gonna just have to call them scalies. And after some research, that is apparently the term. Good to know. So Dragonborn might not compete with humans and elves for mass appeal, but they're still one of the most recognizable races and most popular beast races in modern fantasy. For plenty of players, they're their absolute favorite. Unfortunately, I am not one of those players. Dragonborn have some fantastic ideas behind them, but they are nowhere near one of my favorite fantasy races, and that brings us to the problems with Dragonborn. So, what are my problems with the Dragonborn? First, their entire theme feels almost too powerful to exist on a level playing field with the other fantasy races. Obviously, a human is a human, an elf is just really a human who lives for a long time, and a dwarf is a short, angry Scottish guy. The Dragonborn walks in as a 7-foot tall wall of muscle, covered in natural armor, and can breathe fire. They inherit the appearance and abilities of what is usually the most powerful creature in the entire setting, yet they're expected to be roughly equal to some guy named Greg. Obviously, games like D&D have to balance them mechanically, but this creates a strange disconnect. Dragonborn look like they should tear most humanoids in half, yet their breath weapon might deal less damage than getting stabbed by a rusty sword. The fantasy being promised by their design is often considerably more impressive than what you actually get. My second problem is entirely subjective. I generally just don't like their aesthetic. I'm not traditionally a lizard folk enjoyer. Even in my own fantasy world, my reptilian race is based on newts and salamanders. They're called gutterlings, and they're intentionally small, sticky, and somewhat goofy. Because to me, there's just something inherently goofy about reptiles. Maybe it's my mammalian brain insisting that mammals are smarter, call it mammalian superiority complex if you will, but I have a difficult time looking at a lizard person and taking them completely seriously. Dragons themselves avoid this problem because they're presented more as mythical beasts. And when they are intelligent, it's usually this ancient godlike intelligence that makes them feel fundamentally above ordinary people. Dragonborn possess the appearance of a dragon, but usually not the same overwhelming presence or wisdom. So no. I definitely am not a scaly. If anything, you'd have to call me a furry, as hard as that is to admit, because I'm a proud Khajiit and Tabaxi enjoyer. In my own world building, I even have my own Lynx folk race called the Mirren, which are basically Khajiit from Skyrim with additional steps. I also don't understand the sexualization of the Dragonborn, or lizard people generally, outside of the lusty Argonian maid, which is obviously a foundational piece of Western literature. But with all that being said, I completely understand why people love them. In an alternate universe where I preferred scaly beast folk over furry beast folk, the Dragonborn would probably be one of my favorite races too. They deliver an incredibly specific fantasy, and for most people who want fantasy, there's almost nothing else that can compete. So in conclusion, Dragonborn are pretty cool. They're unique, immediately recognizable, and easily one of the most popular beast races in fantasy. They just aren't for me. I understand the appeal, I am simply on the furry side of the furry scaly divide. But let me know what you think about the Dragonborn. Which fantasy race would you want us to cover next? Join us next week for another fantasy race deep dive. If you enjoy this video, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. You can also join our Discord using the link in the description. And if you somehow found this channel without finding the main Large Lads channel, that will be linked as well. Have a great day, lads.